I Gary and I share something. We're both originally from Jersey City, New Jersey. Okay, so that would be my. I'll let Gary also. He's got a really great connections into the Baltimore area. You went to Maryland Institute of Art, did some work for the Orioles, and had this caravan that you went around from the Babe Ruth Museum. Yep. What, 2004?
2002.
2002, and then he's got this latest book, which I found absolutely fascinating, the book of Outside of the Illustrated Journal of Outside of Baseball. So Gary will be talking to us about that, and he'll also be talking about what he did in 2002 with the Babe Ruth Museum. Take it away, Gary.
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, John. I really appreciate it. It was nice running into you by accident in the bar in Baltimore at the SABR convention. I guess I'll just, my name's Gary Cieradkowski. I'm originally from North Jersey. I grew up there. I probably spent my entire life within 40 miles of Liberty Island, the Statue of Liberty, and until I went to college in Baltimore. This was in the 1980s, and I went to art school there. I went to the Maryland Institute College of Art, and I fell in love with the city. I lived there for about 7 or 8 years, I guess. But as a baseball fan, I really loved the history of Baltimore, not just the Major League Baltimore Orioles, but the minor league Baltimore Orioles and the Negro Leagues, and just such a great baseball town. And all through college, art school, I remember I used to ride my bicycle up to 33rd Street to sneak in like after the 4th or 5th inning to games when I couldn't afford to go. And some of my favorite memories were spent in Baltimore. I guess I'll switch over to my PowerPoint presentation. I'll talk through that, so you don't just get my mug on the computer. So just hold on 1 second here, and let me bring that up. Share screen. Share. Okay. And then. Okay. I'm sorry. Can you see it? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I'm an artist, and I'm also a writer and researcher. So I'm kind of unique in that I do all three things in my work. I don't just do the illustrations. I don't just do the writing, but I combine everything all together. And on this little title screen here, you can see one of my latest projects, which is the 1921 minor league Baltimore Orioles. I just really enjoy that team and learning about all the unique players that played for it. I mean, yeah, it just had some monster players like young Lefty Grove and Jack Bentley, who won the Triple Crown and then was one of the best pitchers in the league. It was just a very unique team, and they won seven consecutive International League pennants. So the 1921 team was right in the middle, and I thought it'd be fun to just do a set of all the players that were on that team. So you see some spread around on this title page here. But as John was saying, I grew up in New Jersey, and I grew up a Mets fan. And being a Mets fan in the mid 1970s up until the early 1980s, it was a really bad team to like. And this picture kind of encompasses what it was like to be a Mets fan back then. So during that time, you can only talk so much about the Mets before you start getting upset. And the people I loved to talk baseball the most with was my dad and his father, my grandfather. And both of these guys were huge baseball fans. The handsome guy over on the right, he was a Brooklyn Dodger man since, I think he said 1916. So he loved the Dodgers. When they left in after 1957, he refused to admit that they were in Los Angeles until the day he died in the early 2000s. He always referred to them as the Brooklyn Dodgers, which of course was very confusing for me as a kid. But through my father and my grandfather, when we'd stop talking about the Mets, they would tell me about all the teams and the players that they liked when they were growing up. So, like I said, my grandfather was a Dodger guy. So he'd tell me about Dazzy Vance and Babe Herman and Jersey Joe Strip and Van Lingle Mungo. My dad grew up in the 1950s and early 60s. So he told me about Jackie Robinson and Duke Snider and Hank Aaron, and his favorite was Warren Spahn. So I got a really good baseball background through these guys, and especially my father, because like me, he loved the more obscure players or the more obscure teams. He was very curious about things, and we used to love talking about the Negro Leagues and things that you didn't normally hear about. Everybody knew about Mickey Mantle and Pete Rose and people like that, but we like the more obscure players. So I went, like I said, I went to art school in Baltimore, and my senior year, between my junior and senior year, I got the luckiest job of my life. I just happened to walk into a design studio that had gotten the job to do Oriole Park at Camden Yards the day before. And I was showing my portfolio, and I happened to have a lot of baseball stuff in there. And they asked me if I liked baseball, and I said, yeah, I love baseball. And nobody in the studio liked baseball. They didn't follow it. And so they hired me on the spot. And within weeks, I was designing parts of Oriole Park at Camden Yard. And these are some of the things that I did, from the logo to the clock to the seating charts, the tickets, all kinds of stuff. It was a really great experience when you're 20, 21 years old. Of course, it was great to work with Janet Marie Smith. She was a big baseball historian, loved baseball history like I did. So she would just have to mention something, like what it's like to sit in Wrigley Field, or, what the vendors were at Ebbets Field or something like that. And I knew exactly what she was talking about, and I would pursue that. So it was a great experience working with her. So after Oriole Park, I kind of moved on, and I did a lot of package design, and I did Folgers and bicycle playing cards and Harley Davidson motorcycle dealerships, all kinds of stuff. And I also loved to keep close to baseball, and I do a lot of the t-shirts for Ebbets Field flannels and Team Brown apparel. I do a lot of Negro League stuff and old minor league things and All American Girls Baseball League stuff. I moved all over the country, Chicago, Baltimore, Kentucky, Cincinnati, Colorado, Hollywood. And through it all, I remained very close with my father, and we would talk a few times a week. And sometimes it was he would just call me up with a trivia question or something like that. But we love, like I said, we still love to talk about the old players and the really interesting ones that had a backstory to it, and maybe we didn't know that much about it. So we'd kind of like split off and do our own research. And it was just great having a baseball friend like that. And then right before the 2009 World Series, he passed away unexpectedly. And all of a sudden I was living out in Hollywood, and I didn't have any friends that liked baseball, let alone obscure baseball. So one night I was sitting alone in my studio, and I was missing my father, and I'm not a very tech savvy person. I've never blogged before or anything like that. And I was missing my dad, and I just did a little drawing of a baseball card and started a blog. And this is what I started. I just came up with a name really quick, and I called it the Infinite Baseball Card Set, because I thought it would be neat to create my own baseball card set of the players that I always wanted to see when I opened up a pack of cards when I was a kid. So the first card I did was a guy from Baltimore, Leon Day. I'm sure most of you are familiar with. I knew him when I was a student in Baltimore. I was very fortunate to get to know him. And through him, he introduced me to a lot of his friends that were players, and I got to sit in with those guys when they would all have a get together. So I thought it was appropriate that I did my first card was of Leon Day. The card just sitting there by itself on a blank page didn't look very interesting. So I just decided to write my own story to go along with it. And I'm not a copywriter or anything like that, but I thought it needed it. And I did that, and I published it. And next time I missed my father, I did another one and another one and another one. And a few months later, people started just landing on my site, and I started making all these friends that were interested in the same type of ball players that I was. Now, the one thing about my art is I don't just copy a photograph. I like to research a player and find out things about him. Figure out like how the guy stood at the plate, or how he made his pitching delivery, how he would stand there, just on the sidelines. So this is Steve Dalkowski, who's supposed to be the A lot of people say he was the fastest ball player of all time. And I read a story that they had hooked up a tire because nobody wanted to stand in against him because he was too wild. So they rigged up a tire when he was in the minor leagues to throw the ball through. So I never saw a picture of it, but I thought it'd be neat to illustrate that. So again, to say what kind of separates my art away from other things is I try to come up with a scene that nobody's ever done before. So like I said, this hasn't ever been depicted before. Same thing with this is Jim Thorpe when he played in the minor leagues for Rocky Mount. There's only one photograph, I believe, that comes from his minor league days. So I try to envision what he was like when he was a pitcher, you know, before, when he was in college, before going to the Olympics. So the blog really took off, and within a year I was featured in ESPN and a couple of newspaper articles and stuff, because at the time nobody was really doing what I was doing. And I was fortunate enough that it landed me a book deal with Simon & Schuster, and this is my first book, which is The League of Outsider Baseball. I think it was 240 pages, hardbound. And I was able to do full page illustrations and also my little baseball card illustrations alongside with the short stories with all the players that I thought had an interesting story. The book enabled me to get a bunch of really, really nice commissions. I was really fortunate. This is for the Chicago Cubs, and it's their Hall of Fame wall, which is underneath the bleachers in Wrigley Field. And it was really neat to be a part of, you know, such a great old ballpark like that, and to be able to illustrate all these players like Hack Wilson and Mordecai Three Finger Brown. And you could see that if you go to Wrigley Field under the bleachers. So that leads me to the book that John introduced, which is 21. I did another version of this a few years ago, and I'm going to try to make it a yearly thing, which the next edition should be out first of the year. It basically it expands upon what I did in my book, because it was my first book was a standard book. I couldn't have sidebars or get into the little tiny nuances that I really like. And this, publishing it this way, I was able to really get into it, different things, and I'll show you what I mean in a second. So this is the cover. Much like the book, I featured the baseball card illustration. This is of Stan Musial. So I go from like very famous players, like, you know, Hall of Famers, and Stan Musial is a great example. But I try to pick an interesting story about him. So I depict him here during World War II when he played for Bainbridge, when he was in the U.S. Navy. And it's interesting because for most people, it would just be his career was interrupted, and then, you know, he went back to being a Hall of Famer after the war. You know, but there was a couple of things that happened to him when he was in the Navy that often gets overlooked. He was an outfielder with the Cardinals before the war, and for some reason, his lieutenant on the baseball team, a guy named Lieutenant O'Brien, decided it was a great idea to turn him into a first baseman instead. He'd never played first base before, so he had to learn. You know, he told the lieutenant that he had never played first base, and the lieutenant said, "I don't care, you're going to learn it." And he did, and he was really bad at first, but he kept practicing and practicing. And that's one of the things that made him such a useful player after the war in the 1940s, 50s, and early 60s, was because he was an outfielder and he was also able to play first base. And that's something that probably wouldn't have happened if he hadn't been in the Navy during the war. Another thing is he was primarily a singles hitter before he went in the Navy. And on the team he played with, a lot of the other ball players, he played with a lot of professional ball players in Hawaii, and a lot of the pro ball players were hitting home runs. And he saw how the GIs and the sailors really responded to that. So he wanted to do something for these guys that were going overseas. So he changed his whole batting style to hit home runs. Again, something that made him into a much better player after the war. This is a Negro League player named Lefty Glover, and it has a really interesting Baltimore connection. When I was in college, freshman year, it was 1988. I was walking around, as I did on weekends, up in the Mount Royal area, and I came upon a lot of people were selling stuff on the sidewalks, and I came upon a little framed photograph of a Negro League player. It said Elite Giants on his jersey, and I knew what that was. And I think it cost me 50 cents or something like that. And I took it home. And when I got back to my apartment, I opened it up, and on the back it said Lefty Glover, Baltimore Elite Giants. So it sent me on this quest that lasted almost 30 years, trying to figure out everything I could about Lefty Glover. He was basically a journeyman pitcher for Baltimore, from the 1937 up until 1945. The thing is, he kind of dropped off after 1945. I couldn't figure out what the heck happened to him. It took me a while, but I figured out that through research and reading other books, he actually died of tuberculosis in a segregated sanitarium outside of Baltimore called Henryton. It was really interesting, and I couldn't find a death certificate for the guy, and I couldn't find basically anything. I couldn't find where he was from. There was all kinds of misleading newspaper articles. Some people said he was from Tennessee. Other people said he was from Georgia. It was just really interesting that he just seemed like such a mystery, while all these other players, actually, you knew where they were from, where they died, and things like that. So it was just kind of a pet project for me for years. And as I said, I was fortunate to know Leon Day. So when I would get together with him and his friends that played in the Negro Leagues, I would bring up Glover, and every once in a while they would give me a tip that I didn't know before. So I still couldn't figure out where the guy was from. And it took me 30 years, and I think it was Christmas last year. I happened to be at my wife's family's house in California, and I decided to look him up again. And I took a folder of all my Lefty Glover information, newspaper clippings and things like that, and notes. And I saw in one of my notes that his middle name was Moss. And I thought that was kind of interesting because it's not a standard middle name. And I found it in another note that I had made that was in the stack of papers. And I decided to go to ancestry.com and put in Thomas Moss with approximate birth date. And I knew he played in Mexico and had gone overseas. So he must have had some type of record of him leaving and coming back to the country. And sure enough, I put in Thomas Moss, and it comes back that he lived in Baltimore and he was a baseball player. So I was able to figure out where exactly he was from, and he was actually from Alabama. So it solved a huge mystery to me. It's probably nothing that most people don't necessarily care about, but for me, it was just a very interesting thing that started off with one photograph that I had found. After I published this, a card dealer from, I believe, Birmingham, sent me a letter and said that he actually had a Type 1 original photograph of who he thought was Lefty Glover. And he actually just sent it to me. It's actually one of the nicer original Negro League photographs that I've ever seen. It's a nice posed action shot. And he was just such a nice guy that he let me have it. I was really surprised. After I published the story on Glover, I was contacted by a couple of members of his family who didn't really know anything about him, and the stuff that I wrote actually closed the loop for them, that they really didn't know. They knew he played in the Negro Leagues, but they didn't know anything about his career. So it was nice to be able to connect with the player's family. So this is a guy who played for Baltimore. His name was Frank Zuppo. One afternoon, I was doing yard work, and I was listening to an old ball game that was on YouTube. It was a 1957 game between the Dodgers and the Reds. But during the game, they're constantly updating the other games that were going on that day. And in Baltimore, the White Sox were playing the Orioles. And in between the games, it was a doubleheader. In between games, the umpires threw out a 17-year-old Baltimore catcher named Frank Zuppo. And that was the only thing that they said. So I'm sitting there doing yard work, and I'm thinking, what the hell? How did they throw out a guy before the game even started? And why was he 17 years old and he's playing for the Orioles? So after I finished my work, I went inside, started looking him up. Turns out he was a bonus baby, and he was playing in his first season with Baltimore. And what had happened was, like I said, he was 17 years old. He was fresh out of high school, and like most high school kids, he wasn't a professional yet. He was still 17 years old. So he had this thing that he used to do was when he was warming up the pitchers, the umpires would walk in between the pitcher and the catcher, going to their position or going to the dugout. And what Frank used to do is he'd jump up really quick and act like he was going to throw the ball to the pitcher when the umpire got right in the trajectory. And of course, the umpires would freak out and yell and, get scared that somebody's going to whip a ball at their head. And he had been told a number of times to knock it off. And so what happened on this particular day, it was a Sunday, and this had been going on for most of the season. So it's an August doubleheader, and the crowd is, Memorial Stadium is packed. And what does Frank Zuppo decide to do in between games of the doubleheader? The umpire, Ed Hurley, is crossing in between the base paths, and Zuppo jumps up and whips the ball. And it's really hot that day. Ed Hurley just had enough, and he throws him out. So he's probably one of the only players that was ever ejected from a game before it even started. So it was just a really interesting, for me, it was a very interesting story. And it was neat to be able to do an illustration for him. He's a very interesting looking guy. He had a unibrow that Frida Kahlo or Wally Moon would be really proud of to have. So it was great doing an illustration of him, as well as doing I love the little details, like the bird patch. When I do my illustrations, I usually try to pick a uniform from a team that, had something really visually interesting. And of course, in the background, I had to put a National Bohemian ad. So like I said, one of the things I like about doing the 21, the Journal of Outsider Baseball, is I can do little sidebars. I just always love sidebars in books. So one of the things that I did for Zuppo was I was wondering about what had happened to most of the other bonus babies. So I went and I found that he was actually the 13th highest paid bonus baby. So I listed the other 12 on top here. He actually got $50,000 to sign with Baltimore. And I also listed what had happened to all the other players. There's a few that actually Catfish Hunter, of course, went on to have a really great career, and Jay Hook had a good career. And but Frank Zuppo, he only played a couple of years, and sparsely at that, before he retired. Right now I live in Kentucky, and I'm fortunate because there's a lot of minor league history around here. And one of the more interesting things that I found that happened around here was in 1909, there was a very low Class D bluegrass league in Kentucky. And there was a fellow by the name of Big Fred Toney, and he was pitching for the Winchester Hustlers, and they were playing a team from Lexington called the Colts. And there was a fellow named Baker that was pitching for Lexington. Toney started for Winchester, and it just turned into, I want to say it's the longest no-hit game of all time. It lasted 17 innings and was finally won in the 17th inning. Baker also pitched the entire game, but unfortunately he lost. Toney, which is very interesting, he went on to duel Hippo Vaughn in, I believe, 1917 in the famous double no-hit game against the Reds versus the Cubs. And he won that game too, but that was only 10 innings. Like I said, this one was 17. And it was just an unbelievable game that was pitched start to finish. That's Toney. That's Fred Toney right there. Now, one of the neat things about living in Kentucky, I was able to call up the town of Winchester and call up the library and see if they had anything on it. And sure enough, they had the actual scorebook from that year that the head scorekeeper had donated to the library in the 1940s. So I drove down there, and sure enough, there it was, just sitting there in a little box. The guy had scored it in ink, kept the same page, went back and doubled up each inning. It was just fascinating to hold a piece of history like that. I was also looking for a contemporary game account from that particular game. In the archives of the Winchester newspaper, that day was missing, and it was feared lost. It just so happens that the scorekeeper must have taken that particular newspaper from the library, clipped out the appropriate parts, and put it in the scorebook. And I just happened to find it by leafing through it. So I was able to include that in my story. This was an interesting guy, Len Konecki. In 1934, he was playing for the Brooklyn Dodgers, and he set a record for outfielding chances and percentage. He was I'm sorry. His percentage was, as an outfielder, was tops at the time. I believe it's subsequently been broken, but it was a big deal at the time. He played in 1934, had a great season. And in 1935, Casey Stengel took over the Dodgers, and he didn't really get along with Konecny. By this time, he was in his 30s. His legs were starting to slow down, so it wasn't as good as an outfielder as he was in 34. And towards the end of the season, him and two other Dodgers got sent down to the minor leagues. They were playing in St. Louis at the time. So they hooked these guys up with plane tickets to fly from St. Louis to, I believe they were going to, I want to say they were going to Buffalo, were the minor league team that they got sent, the AAA team they got sent down to. Anyway, which was rare for the time. Three guys get on a plane. They were going to connect through Chicago. So Konecny and the other two guys, they got some liquor and got really tanked up and started causing especially Konecny in particular, started causing some problems on the plane. So when the plane landed in Chicago, they threw him off and the American Airlines flight, and they wouldn't let him get on his connecting flight. So he's sleeping in the terminal, and a guy comes walking in with a leather jacket on, which at the time, if you wore a leather jacket, there was a chances are you were a pilot. And sure enough, there was this guy by the name of Mulvaney, and he had his own plane that he chartered. So Konecny talks him into doing a night flight to Buffalo. Because Konecny seemed intoxicated at the time, Mulvaney got a buddy of his to go along with him. And so the three of them take off in the night sky. And right from the start, Konecny starts kind of like poking the pilot, and it got to the point where he started getting really aggressive with the pilot, and the pilot was scared that he was going to crash. So they convinced them to sit in the back seat. Meanwhile, the plane that they were flying in was called a Stinson. And let me show you this. So it was a pretty small plane, and the cockpit was about the size of a Volkswagen, like an old Volkswagen Bug. This is an illustration I did based off of a newspaper illustration. So it was very small. It was just a front and back seat, four-seater. They got Konecny to go in the back seat, and suddenly he started punching the pilot. The friend of the pilot, he wound up getting a fire extinguisher and trying to hit Konecny over the head with it, because it got to the point where the plane's rocking back and forth. The pilot can't even keep control of it. Konecny beats up the guy in the back seat with him, leaving just the pilot left. And Konecny starts going to work on the pilot. Well, the fire extinguisher rolls under the seat. Pilot gets it, turns around, manages to beat Len Konecny into submission and actually kills him. Meanwhile, the plane is now entirely lost. The pilot's all bloody. He doesn't know where he is. Like I said, it's dark. He winds up finding some flat area, lands the plane, and there's no lights. And the two men get out of the plane. Konecny's all beat up and bloody inside of it. The two men get out, and all these dogs come and attack them. It turns out that they were on the grounds of a country club in Canada. They had flown so far out of their range. It turned into a little bit of a court case. Eventually the pilot and his friend were cleared. And to this day, nobody really knows what got into Konecny. He wasn't much of a drinker, and he wasn't violent. It's one of baseball's greatest mysteries. But like I said, I love the little details. And I had to do this Indianapolis Indians uniform that he was wearing at the time. It's just such a great uniform. They don't have things like that anymore. So from this book, one of the most polarizing people that I did was Jerry Lewis, the comedian. Either people really like this article or they really hate it because they can't stand Jerry Lewis. But I liked it because he was a huge baseball fan his entire life. He was friends with Leo DeRocher starting from the 1940s when he was a nightclub act, and DeRocher used to love to hang out at nightclubs. So he remained friends with DeRocher when he was with the Dodgers and then the Giants, and then when they all moved out west. And so did Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin. Martin was a baseball fan, and they would go to spring training with the Giants, and were sometimes allowed to participate in exhibition games, and they'd have their own uniforms. And Jerry Lewis actually was a pretty decent first baseman, and some of the players actually complimented him on his chances. He was a huge Gil Hodges fan, and Hodges would give him tips from time to time. While I was doing this story, it was interesting because Lewis actually played in something called the Hollywood Entertainers League. So I did a little sidebar on that, because a lot of the entertainers out there just loved baseball, and they loved being close to the game, and they played it in their spare time. And it's really interesting to think back in time that, you could go to a sandlot in Los Angeles, and Frank Sinatra and it would be playing, second base for his team. Or in the Hollywood Entertainers League, you had a team like the Garner's Gems, which was led by James Garner from the Rockford Files. He was a huge baseball player. His brother actually played in the Pirates system. But all the big nightclubs around there had their own teams, and a lot of the stars from the time would go there on Sundays and just play in the Sandlot in Hollywood. It's really interesting. And then of course they would do charity games for different causes. I believe there was a children's hospital that was their biggest recipient of the money that they would raise. But it's one of those interesting things when you start researching one thing, you kind of go on to something else. The uniform that Jerry Lewis is wearing in this was one that he wore for the team that he had in the Hollywood Entertainers League, which was the Jerry Lewis Clowns, of course. One of my dad's favorite players was Eddie Matthews, and it was a player that I got a lot of requests to cover on my website. But I like to take a famous player, but I like to do something that's most people maybe not are very familiar with. So Eddie Matthews, when he was in the minor leagues, he played for the Atlanta Crackers. My father had a great trivia question that he loved to ask people. He said, "What's the only player that played in Atlanta, Milwaukee, and Boston, and then Milwaukee, and then Boston, Milwaukee, and Atlanta?" And of course, it's Eddie Matthews, because he played for the Atlanta Crackers, then the Milwaukee Brewers when he was in the minor league, then went up to the Boston Braves. Then he went from the Boston Braves to the Milwaukee Braves, and then the Atlanta Braves. It's the only player that did that whole five team rotation. So I decided to concentrate on his time in Atlanta when he was with the Crackers in 1950. And had a tremendous season, but the thing that really stood out for a lot of people was in the stadium in Atlanta, they didn't have an outfield fence per se. They just had a slope that kind of went up towards the scoreboard, and then there was a big open area, and there was a magnolia tree that sat there. And until 1950, there was only one person who hit a home run ball that actually reached the tree, and that was, of course, Babe Ruth. And it didn't reach it on the fly. It kind of hit the ground and kind of bounced and then hit the tree. In 1950, if you read a lot of books on Eddie Matthews, he hit a home run that landed in the tree. He hit many home runs that landed in the tree. He hit a home run that knocked kids out that were sitting in the tree. I mean, all these crazy stories. So I went back and I was like, well, it should be easy to find. It's a huge part of baseball history, especially in Atlanta. So I went back and went through the entire season of all Matthews home runs, and there was absolutely none that matched that said that it hit the magnolia tree. There was a recap at the end of the 1950 season where they talked about everything that happened with the Crackers, and none of it mentioned the magnolia tree home run. So I'm thinking, did this actually happen? And I've tracked all his home runs in the stadium in Atlanta. There was only one that went to center field. He hit everything else to right field and one to left field, but only one went to center field where the magnolia tree was. And they actually went and the groundskeeper measured it, but it didn't measure up to where the magnolia tree was. So it really piqued my curiosity. So what I did was I went and I found all these, aerial views of Ponce de Leon Park in Atlanta. There was no schematics or anything like that. So I found an aerial view from 1950, the same year. And then I did a diagram of what the stadium looked like. I took the dimensions of it, laid it all out. but where the scoreboard was. And I figured out that the magnolia tree was 448 feet. The home run that supposedly went to center field, the only one that he hit, they said it went 400 feet. So of course that's not it. I went back and I finally found a newspaper article that's the groundskeeper went out and measured it again the next day. And sure enough, it was 448 feet exactly, which is where the magnolia tree was. So just little tiny detail that sometimes I kind of get hooked on. So that's it for my book. Am I doing okay on time, John?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
No problem.
So the stories that I write, besides the books that I do, you can go to my website, and most of the stories are on there, as well as the illustrations. So this is what my website looks like now, which is a long way from the old rudimentary one that I started off with. A lot of the times I publish my stories in what I call it the booklet series. It's a subscription series of these small, usually they're 16 to 24 page little booklets, and it comes with a little tipped in card for each one. So these are just some of them lined up, and they look like this. This is the San Musial one. I think I just finished the 51st one, and I sell it by a subscription, and I do about 13 of them a year. So that's what they look like. And I also do right now I do the baseball research journal covers for SABR, as well as the Negro League book that they just put out this past year. I do book covers for summer game books. This was the Saul White's baseball guide, which was updated and reprinted last year, which I was really happy to do, because it's a key piece of Negro League history. Saul White was a ball player dating back to, he started playing in the 1880s, and his career lasted up into the early 1900s. Around I want to say 1909, 1908, there was no official guide or written history on blacks in baseball at the time. So he took it upon himself to do a history book, which became Saul White's official baseball guide. So it was half of it was a history of African Americans in baseball from the 1860s up until 1908. And then the other half was kind of like a Spalding guide of the other Negro League teams that were around at the time. If it wasn't for him writing this book, probably the entire history of early Negro League baseball would have been lost. It's been reprinted a few times. This partial this because I did the cover, but it has a really great introduction and notes by Gary Ashwell, who's a tremendous Negro League historian. So if you can find a copy of this, it's really indispensable to baseball historians, and it was I was really proud to be able to do the cover for this book, because like I said, if Saul White didn't write this book, so much of baseball history would have been lost. I also do a lot of fiction covers. This one I think is up for a fiction award right now. It's about Christy Mathewson's time in the Army, and what had happened to him. Was he gassed? Was it a conspiracy? This was a book on a minor league team in Waverly, New York, at the turn of the century. And that's what I got here.
And anyone can touch base with you. They go to studiogaryc.com. Yep,
that's my. You can see my other design, my regular design work. But if you just go to the baseball section, you go right to the blog, and you can email me. You can just go through all the stories that I've written and just see other stuff that I got.
Well, it's fascinating stuff, Gary. Let's turn it over for questions. Anybody have questions for Gary?
Excuse me.
Yes.
I have your book. So that's a really good book. I really like it.
Thank you.
Is there anybody that you had a hard time writing on or writing about?
Like some players are the more famous they are, the harder it is, because I try, like I said, I try to find something interesting about them. that I'm not familiar with, just so I learn something and hopefully other people do. Like if you're writing about like Joe DiMaggio or something, there's just so many things that his life has been written about so many times. It's hard to find something out about that. I mean, other times, if you're writing about a Negro League player, sometimes it's hard to find really good information about that because the black press, a lot of the old newspapers you can't get anymore, so it's a little bit harder to find. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
If I can jump.
One of the things, go ahead, good question.
That was me, Jerry. If I can jump in, I have the other side of this. Since Gary was nice enough to include one of my book covers in the show, I can tell you what it's like to work with Gary as an artist. He's done 3 covers for me on the Summer Game book.
I didn't know you were on here.
Yeah, hiding away. And it was he understands what's in these books, and he finds a way of pulling things out of them and making them into these attractive graphic packages. And it's just wonderful working with him. I'm hoping he'll do my next one.
I'll be there. Was I right about the This Never Happened was the one that came up with the fiction award?
Well, it was This Never Happened was up for Sports Book of the Year last year.
Okay.
And the Doubleday book was up for the Sports Fiction Award this year.
Okay, that's what
and
it was.
They both ended up kind of runners up.
Oh, okay.
But thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Comments, questions?
I just have a couple of things from the other Gary. I have,
Gary, go.
yeah, exactly, yeah. I have a bunch of your pieces, just some cards and some of the booklets that I use for gifts. These are marvelous little pieces. Some not so little. I don't mean to denigrate that.
No.
I mean, baseball cards are small. That's just the reality of things. But they're wonderful. Let me ask you this: your art style, your painting style. A couple of things. With respect to the cards, although all the figures seem to come out of the same mold, how is it that, I mean, who influenced you with respect to like the black outlines? I mean, how did you come about with this style as opposed to something other than this style?
Yeah, that's a really good question. As an illustrator, I usually work in colored pencil, sometimes in gouache paint, a lot of pen and ink, and then also pencil. A lot of my baseball portraits that I did pre my website were in colored pencil, and I have like a technique that I use, and it kind of looks like an oil painting. But they take me a long time to do. Now, when I started the website, it was in my spare time. So I wanted to come up with a particular style that I could do very quickly and still make it the way that I want. I love the old German poster artists from the 1920s, which used very flat, bold colors. And also, there's a guy by the name of Edward Penfield that was an American illustrator around the turn of the century, who used a very strong black outline. And then also Toulouse-Lautrec. I love that guy, just his drawings and lithographs. But so what I had to do was come up with a style that I could do very quickly. And it took me a while, but I narrowed it down to this black outline style, which was kind of different than anything that I've ever done before. But I was able to do a pencil drawing and then do it in ink on top of it, and then bring all that into the computer. And then I would also do the color blocks. Like if you look at the picture of Jack Dunn on this page here, the black sweater would be one layer, almost like a screen print. So I'd bring all these different layers into the computer and then add the details on. So it was, once I have if I have all the research done, as far as what the uniform looked like and things like that, I could go from a pencil sketch to a finished illustration, within a few hours and very, very quickly, as opposed to spending all day on a colored pencil drawing or 2 days on a painting. So that's where that came from. Does that?
Yeah, that's sure. That's fascinating. And just to get in a plug, I'm an unpaid endorser. Christmas is coming up. These make wonderful gifts. The cards, the booklets, the books.
Thanks.
If you know anybody that's interested in baseball.
If you're
make
still
wonderful
interested in how I do my research and then the cards, I mean, the illustrations and all of that, I have a whole series on my website where I go from the start to the end of everything, from just coming up with the idea, where they come from, to do the research, and how step by step I do each illustration. So if you go to my website, you can find that.
Okay, great, thanks.
I didn't think a lot of people would be interested in that, but I always got a lot of requests for that, which kind of surprised me, because to me, I just do it naturally. So I finally sat down and went through the whole thing last year and did a whole series.
I think Jeff has a comment or a question. Jeff Warner?
No, I didn't have anything.
Oh, okay.
It's all really
Your
interesting.
name popped up, so I thought maybe you had something.
Oh, yeah, I see the square keeps highlighting there. I don't know if I'm making some kind of noise here or not.
Okay. Gary, can you talk a little bit about your connection with the Babe Ruth Museum and what you did in 2002?
Yeah. I don't know if a lot of you know Charlie Vassalero he's in the Babe Ruth chapter,
yeah.
lives in Baltimore.
Yeah, everybody knows Charlie. He's not on.
I didn't want to be presumptuous. Yeah, so I was living out in Boulder, Colorado, and it was the winter of 01, 02, and I'd lost my job out there, and I knew I didn't want to live in Colorado anymore. And I just didn't know where I wanted to go. So I thought about going back east. And like I said, I used to live in Baltimore. So I thought about living in Washington, D.C. And so I took a trip at Christmas time and I was staying in Baltimore for a few days. And a friend of mine from college said that there's this guy and you just got to meet him because he's a Mets fan like you. And he's a crazy baseball nut. And I think you'd really get along with him. So sure enough, we met for dinner or something like that, the three of us, and Charlie and I hit it off. And a few days later, I was still in Baltimore, and he asked me if I wanted to go out and get a drink one night. So I said, okay. So we went to this bar, and he's just buying me drink after drink after drink, and we're having a good time, good conversation. And then finally, he goes, I gotta ask you something. He says, I work for the Babe Ruth Museum, and I take an exhibit around the country. I did it last year. This year they're making me take an assistant along. And he's like, I want to ask you if you would do that. And I was like, oh, so he was kind of just testing me to see if I can hold my liquor, I guess. And then once I passed the test, he sprung the job offer on me. And that was something I'd worked as a professional graphic designer and illustrator since I was 19 years old. And to take a year off and tour with a baseball exhibit just seemed crazy to me. And I said, I don't know, I really got to think about this. So I called my father the next morning and I told him the whole thing. And he goes, you're freaking nuts if you don't take this. So I did. And Charlie and I, we started off in spring training in Arizona with the Cactus League. And we had an exhibit. And it was a big mobile exhibit that we had traveled around in a big truck. And we had to take it out, giant panels, and put it together. It had one of Babe Ruth's bats from 1927. Had a pair of his pants, one of his contracts, a trophy. So I think there was a signed ball. It was a really interesting group of stuff, and I'm really surprised they entrusted them to Charlie to take around the country. So we went to all the major league teams in Arizona for spring training, and then we for the rest of the season we went and did minor league parks from single A all the way up to triple A. And then in between, because we would usually be in town for like a Friday, Saturday, and Sunday game, and then we'd have a few days off to travel to the next venue. So we'd always be passing through major league parks. So of course we'd go to as many major league games as we could possibly get. And because we had the stuff, Babe Ruth's bat and things like that, Charlie was able to get himself on the radio in every city that we went to. And the major league teams would give Compass tickets to go to a game and stuff. And it was just a great experience to, as Charlie likes to call it, he calls it barnstorming with the Babe, which is essentially what we did. It was a really cool experience. I'd never do it again, but it was a lot of fun. And I can't remember how many, but I added up how many ball games I saw that summer. I mean, it was just unreal. It was like 180 or something like that. It was ridiculous. It was great palling around with Charlie for 9 months. We went and saw so many things, and just the stories that we were able to hear. Like I said, this was 2002, and there were still people around that met Babe Ruth. We had like a little like sign-in book that we'd left on the table in front of the exhibit, and I think we were in Phoenix or something in spring training, and neither one of us was standing around by the sign-in book. And when Charlie went around and looked at it, somebody had wrote in there, "Babe Ruth saved my little brother's life." And that's all this person wrote. We're like, what the heck is that? We missed the person, and we wanted to learn that story. So Charlie runs up to the press booth, and they made an announcement over the loudspeaker, whoever made that, can you please go to the Babe Ruth exhibit? And it was this old lady. And she was the story goes, she was a war refugee from Russia after the Second World War in 1946. Her little brother had a heart defect, and because they were refugees, they didn't have any money. And if the little brother didn't get a very expensive operation, he was going to die. Somehow, some way, Babe Ruth found out about it. There was no fanfare, nothing, but he paid for this little kid's operation. I believe it was, oh gosh, it was in a hospital. They lived in New York. It was a hospital someplace out in the Midwest. It was an experimental and very, the recovery time was very long. So Babe Ruth paid for the operation, paid for the family to live there for as long as it took for the kid to recover, and saved the little boy's life. It was never in any newspaper, never made a big deal about it or anything like that. But this guy that they never met, that played a sport they never heard of, saved this little boy's life. It was just really neat to hear stories like that. That was one that always stuck in my head.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Gary. Fascinating.
Yeah, one other thing too was really interesting. If I have time, I went to visit my brother in Jersey City because we were at the Brooklyn Cyclones ballpark. So I was staying at my brother's house in Jersey City, and we couldn't leave the artifacts, at the stadium at night. We had to take them back to the hotel or wherever we were staying and safeguard them. So I was entrusted with the 1927 Babe Ruth bat. So I went back and I was staying at my brother's apartment, and all our friends, mutual friends, had come over that night, and we're all hanging out. Probably, I don't know, maybe like 10, 12 guys, and nobody's really a baseball fan besides myself. And they're all making fun of me, kidding me about taking a year off and traveling around with this dopey exhibit and things like that. And they're asking about Babe Ruth, and of course everybody knows who Babe Ruth is, but these guys are younger and they're soccer fans, and so I went upstairs and I had the bat hidden on the bottom of a closet just in case, So I went upstairs and I got the case with the bat in it, and I brought it downstairs. And like I said, there's 10 or 12 guys and they're just sitting around, and I took that thing out and I held it up and I showed it to them, and it's like this hush came over the whole group of guys. And everybody got quiet, and I just started telling a couple of Babe Ruth stories, and people were like, can I hold it? And I said, yeah, just be careful. And they're holding this bat, and it's like something just came over at them. It's like they remembered how big of a deal Babe Ruth was when they were kids. And even though they weren't baseball fans, they all knew what an important figure Babe Ruth was. And I like to think that I kind of converted a few guys that night into being baseball fans. But it was just, that was one of my favorite nights of that whole summer, just to be able to share that with a bunch of people that didn't necessarily care. And it just showed like 50 something years after the guy died, he still held something special that made all these people that didn't care about baseball, stop and think about it.
As Mike Gibbons said at the SABR convention, that Babe Ruth just is so much above baseball in terms of everyone knows Babe Ruth, no matter where they are, even throughout the world.
Yeah.
Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, I got something.
Go ahead.
Hey, I'm up here in North Jersey. Hey, Gary, how's it going?
Hi.
I was just curious, do you have any, like, along the lines of these the Baltimore set, do you have any plans for, another kind of like themed grouping like that?
I'm not really sure. It's kind of hard to do like a whole whole team, I tend to lose interest after a while, because if you look through my site or see the booklet series, I jump all over the place because I just try to keep it interesting to myself. I had been thinking about doing the Baltimore team for a long time, so I was able to keep my focus on that. I'm not a Yankee fan, but one team I'd like to do is maybe the 1927 Yankees in the same format. There's a lot of interesting players that, weren't the big name guys, that had interesting stories. And then of course you got Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and Herb Pennock and all those guys too. So I might do it again. Yeah, I don't have any plans right now, but we'll see. I keep getting asked to do the 27 Yankees, and I did a lot of research on it, and I have all the pieces I need for it. I just need to sit down and do it. Like I said, the key is just keeping my interest through a whole series like that, because I'd like to do, not just the starters. I'd like to do all the guys on the bench, the trainer, maybe the owner, things like that. So I like to get into a little detailed part of it. I think I might turn this Orioles set into a book eventually. So I'd probably do the same thing with the Yankees if I ever did that.
I find it fascinating, these little sidebars you have on some very famous players. Can you touch on the Mickey Mantle? You have got Mickey Mantle in your book. What was the little sidebar you might have on Mickey Mantle?
Yeah, the story that I focused on was his rookie year in 1951. To me, it was very interesting, because when you read the press stuff going back into 1950, I mean, he was Joe DiMaggio's heir apparent, and he was taken over from the great DiMaggio, and I mean, he hadn't even been up to the past, was essentially single A at the time. But he makes the team in 1951, and it's kind of heartbreaking, because he's a young guy, and he's like anybody else who's, I think he was 19 or something, maybe 20 years old at the time. He's relatively young, from a rural area, and here he is in New York City all of a sudden, and he's supposed to take over from Joe DiMaggio. It didn't make it any better that he gets up to the Yankees, and DiMaggio doesn't want anything to do with him. In fact, he was downright rude to him. There's a famous story, I'm sure a lot of you have heard, that the first time the Yankees were playing Boston, Ted Williams wanted to meet Mickey Mantle, and he saw him standing over by DiMaggio, and DiMaggio wouldn't even introduce him to Ted Williams, just kind of ignored him. It's just what do you got to do that for? I mean, it's just the kid was already in a tough enough spot. So he starts off the 51 season, and he's doing okay. Then he starts to strike out, and all these there's a bunch of scam artists that have started to hover around him and trying to get him into all kinds of money schemes, like endorsements and things like that. He starts dating a showgirl. It just really quickly, his career starts to go downhill. The press starts to get on him. He starts striking out. There's a famous story where he starts swearing after he strikes out, which was a big deal in 1951, especially if you're on the Yankees. So anyway, there was a season ticket holder, an older lady that was in the box seats, and she heard him swear, and she kind of yelled something over to him. He yelled something back, and it's just a terrible spot for a kid to be in. So long story short, Casey Stengel winds up sending him down to the Kansas City, what were they called back then? Kansas City Blues, which was their one of their top farm clubs. And he comes close to quitting the game. And, it's a story where his father drives out there and gives him a tough love pep talk. So that's what my story was about, was just like how all of a sudden this great promising career looks like it's on the rocks, and, how he tries to bring it back. And he comes back at the end of the season and actually has a pretty decent season. It was when I was writing that story, and this might be what John was alluding to, it was interesting because how all the teams hated the Yankees back then. Even in 1951, there was like an epidemic of people throwing pop bottles at the Yankees in the summer of 51. And especially bad in Comiskey Park, where they started throwing fireworks at the outfielders. And at one point during one game, and this is right before he got sent down, so think of how Mickey Mantle is at the time. He's this kid. His career seems like it's going down the tubes. People are trying to take advantage of him. He knows it's just time before he gets sent down. He's playing. He goes back for a fly ball, and somebody throws an M80 out at a crowd at him. And it. There's a couple of great quotes from Casey Stengel after that, where he starts going off on the fans, and I expect, what if that was close to his eye? Kid could have lost an eye. It was just a really interesting how nasty fans were back then. You hear stories and kind of, I always kind of equated it to like in the 1970s when I used to go to Yankee Stadium and fans used to throw stuff at Reggie Jackson and things like that. But man, even in 1951, it was really nasty.
Well, 1951, I was a Giants fan in Jersey City, and I hated the Yankees.
But you didn't bring fireworks to Roosevelt Stadium, did you?
Right. Okay. I believe there was a question that was somebody posted a question on the Mets. Do we have a question on the Mets? Okay. I thought I saw something. Is there anyone else with comments or questions? Well, it's about a couple of minutes before the Game 4 of the World Series. I hope you've been enjoying it. I have. I'm kind of a National Leaguer, and I kind of picked the Phillies in 5, so far so good. Okay, Gary, really appreciate tonight. You did a wonderful job. We appreciate all you've done. You opened up my eyes as to some of the things, and I didn't realize those Ebbets Fields T-shirts I have is your design on them. Okay, so once again, thank you very much, Gary, and Peter sends his best.
Thanks for having me, and everybody that bought my book. I really appreciate that, and please stop by the website and see the new stories that I come out with. I really appreciate you guys taking time out.
Okay, thank you very much, guys, and we enjoyed having you. And keep in touch with the Beirut chapter, okay?
Will do.
And take care, Gary.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Bye. Okay, I'm going to end the session. Thank you for joining us.